Hi, this is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the MASH Tsunami podcast. This week we are offering 4 conversations from episode 16, our episode Remembering Stephen Harrison with Donna Cryer, Jörn Schattenberg, and Dimitar Tonev. Plus, from the vault, the last new drug study Stephen ever shared on the podcast, which was last July. This conversation includes the first half of Jörn Schattenberg and my interview with Donna Cryer. While the question is about Stephen's most outstanding contribution to MASLD, the focus is more on his remarkable ability to trigger increased awareness of MASH and MASLD in many different ways. I start this conversation by asking Jörn and Donna to describe one outstanding contribution, maybe 2, but not 8, that Stephen made to the field of MASLD. Jörn talks about Stephen's role as integrator, talking to all different kinds of players, designing trials, focusing on issues, needs of patients, regulators, investors, traveling everywhere, being with everyone. To Jörn, Stephen was, and I quote, a lens focusing that something that was needed to spark the fire. Picking up on this insight, I asked specifically about Stephen's role in the founding of NAIL-NIT along with Mazen Noureddin. Jörn harkens all the way back to Stephen's earlier work on the LITMUS Cohort Studies and contributions to the field to describe the process that led him and Mazen to start at NAIL-NIT, and notes that consortium's tremendous success to date in terms of presentations and posters at the upcoming EASL Congress. Continuing this theme, Donna describes Stephen's ability to bring people together and his providing, and I quote again, unique space for having smaller, intimate conversations when necessary. She cites the NASH-TAG, another event he co-founded, as a meeting designed specifically for those kinds of conversations, and as a result, a remarkably fertile place for people to make progress on big issues. I recall Stephen bringing Donna to the early podcast to describe International NASH Day in 2021, and I go on to comment that Stephen was the rare individual who embodied all 3 legs of Malcolm Gladwell's social virus stool. As a scientist, tremendously knowledgeable in the area, as an integrator who can put people together for common purposes, and as a salesman who can then take the results and his vision and sell it. Although I don't say this in the interview, the implication is that Stephen's ability to play all these roles at once has sped the social awareness of MASLD and MASH and the efforts to advance solutions that have led to things like Resdifra. Finally, I recall Stephen becoming ticked off during an early Surfing MASH episode on FDA's first complete response letter for obeticholic acid, which to me was a proof of his passion for his work, his energy, and the fact that since I only saw it once, I thought it was a pretty impressive moment and a trait not to have more often. I'm simply going to repeat what I said at the end of episode 14 Conversations. Stephen was one of the most unique individuals I've ever had the pleasure to know and work with. These conversations touch on just a small sampling of what made Stephen Stephen. So just sit back, listen, learn, absorb. When you're done, check out and perhaps contribute to the memorial page on our LinkedIn discussion group. We'd love to hear your recollections as well. Let's jump in the middle, talk about his one most outstanding contribution to the field. And it's hard to come up with one because there have been so many. But if you had to pick one, or maybe 2, we can cheat a little bit, but not more than 2. First time I asked this question, someone listed 8. I said, gee, that's not 1 or 2. So just 1 or 2 particular contributions to the field. And they can be things other people have talked about before.
Jörn Schattenberg.
On the tough questions, right? So this brings me back to obviously sad memory of Stephen passing. And I think where we left off last time was that I mentioned that his energy was unprecedented from my perspective. His energy, talking about the disease to colleagues, talking to sponsors, wanting to move into the field, designing a clinical trial, talking to patients, enrolling them into clinical trials, talking to the regulators, to investors. So I think he was really, he was there as a lens, focusing that sunbeam that was needed to spark the fire and get the whole momentum into the field. I think that was one of his big contributions, that he was at so many places, with his energy, connecting so many people that eventually contributed to the success story, which in the end led to the approval of a first drug.
Jörn, let me ask you another one, okay? Because I know that you were involved early on in the formation of NAIL-NIT, which I think was a really important and innovative way of thinking about how do we get past biopsy. So if you want to comment a little bit about that, or if you could comment a little bit about that, that would be great.
Yeah, Stephen clearly was a pioneer thinking about removing variability from clinical trials and uncertainty. So the field of NITs, or non-invasive tests, was something he's been dealing about for quite some time. And he's published a couple of landmark papers on the prevalence, but been fundamental in driving the development of non-invasive tests and some of the big research consortiums. So a few people know that from the very beginning, he was there to actually co-design the LITMUS Cohort Study, which is a big study we conducted in Europe. He co-led one of the imaging work packages, and he was there from the beginning thinking about ways to establish non-invasive testing and push that forward, talking to the regulators, getting them validated, moving away from from biopsy in clinical trials. And NAIL-NIT follows the same pattern, I think, with his expertise and experience in running in clinical trials. NIT built on the large trial databases we had, a lot of very patchy databases or data sets that weren't connected. And knowing Stephen, he aimed big. And so he tried to pull everybody together, and he succeeded in NAIL-NIT doing so in quite a number of responses together. And I think that's what's unique about NAIL-NIT. And that data set has since then produced amazing data. Again, data will be presented in Milano now. I believe it's 8 or 10 abstracts. Stephen would have had an oral presentation of one of those. And now, unfortunately, he's not around to give that.
Yeah, very unfortunately. It'll feel like a different event for him not being there. Donna, you have thoughts you want to add or share on that topic?
Donna Cryer.
Sure. I have a short and long answer. The long answer, giving context, because, as I approached this, I was wondering what else is there left to be said? You all did such a great job and really hit the mark and captured so many things on the first rounds. And I agreed that my teammate, Jeff McIntyre, captured one of my favorite phrases, that, some days the butter slides off your biscuit. And so I was thinking, what would I add to that? The first condolence comments I wrote about Stephen was about 2 hours before I buried my own mother. So in that space that morning, experiencing both losses, there was really no one else that I would have taken the time out to really acknowledge formally, except for Stephen, because he meant so much to me and to the organization and to all of us. And so a few people impressed me, few were astounded, and only a handful consistently surprised me. And Stephen always did. I'll talk more about a specific thought I had, but my short answer is NASH-TAG, in that is one of his, many creative entrepreneurial efforts and his, special way of bringing people together to solve problems. I think it really did provide a unique space for having smaller, more intimate conversations to work things out. So not only to present the science, but to have a particular type of conversations around the science and the different controversies and sometimes like the failures and the lessons learned so that we can pick ourselves back up. But that unique platform and space that he created at NASH-TAG has certainly had an impact on the field and will have an enduring impact, not just on, specific outcomes or approvals, but really how we all work with each other and understand each other and conduct conversations with each other. I would say, NASH-TAG was one of the things that I really appreciated, Stephen contributing, and I was so privileged to be a part of as well.
That's great. So first of all, when I think of Stephen, I think of the idea that, A, we started the podcast, but B, we're 6 episodes into the podcast, and it's the first week that we don't have something we know we're going to do. And I say to Stephen, what are we going to do? And he says, it's International NASH Day. So why don't we see if we can get Donna to come on? And Donna came on, talked about International NASH Day. I don't know that was the first time you met Louise, but it might have been. I don't recall that you saw each other before that. First time we met, and it was a great conversation. And one of the things that speaks to is Malcolm Gladwell wrote this book called The Tipping Point, which is about how ideas take shape. Right. And he identified there being 3 specific kinds of individuals who made things happen. Scientists, that is, people who understood the science of what was going on better or differently than anyone else did. And then there were connectors who, by force of personality, and had collected such a breadth of individuals around them that they always knew who to put together to make something happen. And then there were salesmen, and that's people who could take the idea and drive it. Many people are one of those. A few people are 2 of those. Virtually nobody is 3 of those, which made Stephen kind of a unicorn.
Yes.
Because he was all 3. That's the first part. But bringing Donna to the party, Donna wound up being a fantastic guest host for a little while until she figured out she just couldn't fit that into her energy load and schedule, sadly for all of us. But the other thing about Stephen is I only saw Stephen's temper once, really. And Donna knows the story I'm going to tell. It's 6 episodes later, still the early days of the podcast, and Intercept gets their first NDA letter for obeticholic acid. And we decided to try to bring on the podcast somebody with a background in regulatory affairs. And a friend of mine made a recommendation who we brought on the podcast. She will go unnamed, but right now she's kind of smiling as I tell this story. And he proceeded to suggest that if the FDA had their way, they would do away with conditional approvals altogether. I thought Stephen was going to come through the phone at him. He was polite, but he was clearly ticked, to use a word, and it got louder and very, very questioning. And we played that back at a later point in time after the NIT workshop to talk about who was right on that issue and who was wrong. Now, I can't comment about what FDA people say at cocktail parties, but it's clear which way the science went on this. But it's the only time I ever saw anything really upset him. And it wasn't because he felt personally challenged, it's because all this was his baby and because what the guy said felt so wrong to him. It turned out not to be right. That is 2 clear memories of mine, bringing down to the podcast and then that particular topic.
And now back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded this conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingmash.com. Next week, we will preview the EASL Congress 2024 with President Alexander Krag, Jörn Schattenberg, and perhaps some of the other key European KOLs. Until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.